least at the start, folks. Okay, we're going to begin now. All right, welcome. This is lecture number 10 of Sociology of Popular Culture. Whoops, sorry, just lost me for a sec. Sociology of Popular Culture, it's the 25th of November, number 10 lectures, thinking about Adorno and his essay that we've been reading, Über Jazz, but thinking about Vietnam as well, okay? So there are a couple of bits of video I wanted to start off with. It's a bit slow, I know, but yeah, first of all, I'll give you these links to watch. Whoops. Adorno in Vietnam is on YouTube. I'll put these links, they're not actually accessible as clickable links on the PowerPoint, but I will make that happen in a bit. Because I actually want to show this bit of footage just to see, well, to commemorate. Why is it not playing?
Broke through the gates of the
It's not playing for some reason.
Independence Palace. Broke through the gates of the Independence Palace.
All right. Got a slight technical problem there. For some reason, it's not playing. Let me get out of that. We'll instead watch this one.
Và tuần này thì mình sẽ share cho mọi người cái app tên là Grammarly. Đây là như kiểu là digital writing.
Der Vietnamkrieg.
Okay, so it's in German. We don't really need the sound so much. Oh, it's got subtitles. We keep a bit of sound. And now I want to share that. How do I do that? Forgotten how all this works, right? Share screen. Tab. All right, so this is Adorno's, Adorno talking about popular music in a video. It's got English subtitles so you can follow. And I need to turn off my sound here, don't I? If you can't hear it, you
solidarisierte die Menschen durch das Fernsehen. Die US Army erobert ein Bauerndorf und zündet es an, vor den Augen der Welt. Das Fernsehen brachte Bilder ins Wohnzimmer, die niemand bestellt hatte und die jeder innerlich kommentieren musste, ob er wollte oder nicht. Zur Empörung gesellte sich, ebenso weltweit, eine Musik, die im Nachhinein entsetzlich kitschig klingt, damals aber ein Mittel des Protests war.
Okay, it says there are English subtitles. You see on the heading, but there are not. So it's auf Deutsch, and I'll have to translate. So he's saying the English 60s, talking about the 60s, the protest movement against the war in Vietnam, right? In America, this is a protest against the war, and in Germany as well. And this aggravated the German state, of course. It talks about what has happened to my subtitles.
Mit dem Schielen nach dem Konsum verbunden ist, das
So really, translating Adorno is really difficult, and then translating him speaking in German when they promised English annotations. Here he's talking about how this is not really protest, that there's nothing to be achieved from this musical protest. It's also a commodity. But you see, it says on the screen, now with English annotation, where? And it won't allow a translation. So look, here, it even has...
Looks like you're having a hard time
Well, I
reading on
will
the web.
try again.
Wait, are you seriously trying to highlight?
Oh, I think this is what it's meant to be. Ja.
Ich glaube allerdings, dass Versuche, politischen Protest mit der Popular Music, also mit der Unterhaltungsmusik, zusammenzubringen, deshalb zum Scheitern verurteilt sind, weil die ganze Sphäre der Unterhaltungsmusik, auch wo sie irgendwie modernistisch sich aufputzt, so mit dem wahren Charakter, mit dem Amüsement, mit dem Schielen nach dem Konsum verbunden ist, dass also Versuche, dem eine veränderte Funktion zu geben, ganz äußerlich bleiben. Und ich muss sagen, wenn also dann irgendjemand sich hinstellt und auf eine im Grunde doch schnulzenhafte Musik dann irgendwelche Dinge darüber singt, dass Vietnam nicht zu ertragen sei, dann finde ich, dass gerade dieser Song nicht zu ertragen ist, weil er, indem er das Entsetzliche noch irgendwie konsumierbar macht, schließlich auch daraus noch etwas wie Konsumqualitäten herauspresst.
Okay, that was it.
Scheitern verurteilt sind, weil die
So this is, I'll turn the sound off for Adorno. We don't need to hear his German. We have the English subtitles. The entire sphere of popular music dresses itself up in modernist disguise. And he says he finds it unbearable when there's someone singing a song about how unbearable the war in Vietnam is, right? And he talks about the cross-eyed transfixion with amusement, right? The cross-eyed, we're staring at the screen so long, we become cross-eyed. Great phrase, but it's really this where he finds a song sold on the popular music scene about maudlin music, sad music about Vietnam and how unbearable it is a kind of, he finds that this song is itself unbearable. By taking the horrendous and making it somehow consumable, you've made it into a kind of commodity. He actually doesn't say horrendous. He says the chaos of the situation in Vietnam. So his understanding of what was going on in Vietnam maybe doesn't come through here, but certainly what he's railing against in this little interview, where he explains in this lovely little nugget of him speaking just for a couple of minutes to a reporter, with the images, of course, that helps make it the entire sphere of popular music. This is the same argument that Uber Jazz offers, all right, at one level. That the culture industry has us in thrall. We are trapped by the culture industry, and it does nothing to us but entertains us with tragedies. And actually the news reports and the footage that was being shown in Germany and America at the time, the news reports were unbearable for many, and that caused them to go out on the streets. But at the same time, they were also a kind of commodification. Yeah. Anyway, that's the nub of the whole deal, I think. Now, the essay I asked you to read last week, actually, and this week, is Über Jazz. And I guess the issue that will be a question for the question time and for discussion is what was Adorno's feeling about jazz, right? In favor of jazz, I've put a link there for you to chase down the history of Blue Note. There's two links actually for modern jazz and Blue Note. Blue Note was a label that still going for 60 years or so has presented some fantastic jazz musicians, Thelonious Monk and Coltrane and so many. I mean, all of the great jazz musicians. And it has a very distinctive visual style that some of you know already because we talked about it in relation to selfies in the other class, right? And I know there was a dimension of, because the albums are always with a dark background and a light on the performer to really foreground the performance, a person with their instrument, right? You know, a trumpeter with the trumpet and so on. Having said that, then Adorno on jazz, and I guess how Vietnam turned into a commodity for the culture industry in all these movies, right? I mean, it's not like Rambo or Full Metal Jacket or Deer Hunter, all these Vietnam movies, the classic Hollywood versions of Vietnam, were anti-war films. Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola described Apocalypse Now, and he said it's not an anti-war film. It's making entertainment out of war. And that's really something still to think about. How is it that so many of our Hollywood entertainments take on such things that have a grotesque and horrendous and unbearable aspect in real life? Explosions and terrorists and I mean you name it. Everything from car chases and accidents through to the apocalypse when asteroids hit the Earth. All these films make commodities, make entertainments out of disaster. I mean, it would be disaster to run your car into a horde of police blockades on the highway, and the crashes of, I don't know, think of a film like The Blues Brothers, so many cars destroyed. And yeah, I get that it's entertainment, and you know, so nobody loves a big explosion in space more than me in science fiction. The planet Alderaan destroyed by Darth Vader, all right? You know, but the idea that we might have got to a situation where we think that we can not even think about, we just accept that the destruction of a planet in science fiction or whatever, a whole planet, and that can be represented as just a moment of tremor in the force, is what Obi-Wan Kenobi says, is 8 million souls dying all at once, or 800 million, or however many people lived on Alderaan, is bizarre. And that First Blood, Rambo, Full Metal Jacket, and Deer Hunter can have made entertainment about the war here that had really such an impact on Vietnamese lives and American lives, no doubt. Not as many. And they walked into it in Australian lives. They walked into it on purpose. is still surely got to seem bizarre to everyone when you think about it. But we're encouraged not to think about it, is the thing.
Broke through the gates of the Independence Palace.
No, the video keeps on stopping. So this is the tank breaking through the gates of the Independence Palace. It's film shot by a guy called David Bailey, an Australian filmmaker who stayed on the steps of the Independence Palace waiting after everyone from the media and from the American side fled. You know, the famous images of a helicopter. Well, somebody took the images, helicopter taking people off the roof of this Independence Palace. But here are the tanks, 2 tanks. I forget their numbers right now, 317, I think, or 374, famous anyway, breaking through the gates of the palace, was then the palace of one of the generals in 75. And then if the footage continued, you would see someone running with the flag of the NFL to put the flag on the top of the palace, what's now called the Reunification Palace. So that's why I was interested in this scene and thinking, well, if Adorno had lived another 7 years, he would have seen this piece of footage. And I wonder how he would have thought about this, because he certainly saw the protests against the war in Vietnam, in Germany, in 67, 68. But then he died in 69. And he died after some of the so-called 68 protests. The students had asked him for support. And, well, they'd invaded his classroom, actually. It was, Adorno hadn't publicly supported the protesting students. And in fact, they occupied the Institute for Social Research for these reasons, trying to get him to support it. And he was so opposed to them doing so that he called the police on the students. And the students are upset about this. Some of them, 2 of the students, bared their breasts in his class, and you know, he would have been terribly embarrassed by that. But tragically, he dies in that summer before he suspends his classes and doesn't go back onto the campus because of campus unrest, and passes away. But what if Adorno were here now? What might he say when we think of his critique of jazz and think about, you know, V-pop and K-pop and J-pop, and just how exaggerated popular music seems today. It seems to like fill out exactly the things that he was critical of in Current of Music and in this essay on jazz I've been asking you to read. What does he say on jazz? Is he for or against jazz? He's ostensibly against jazz. In Über Jazz, which means, well, which officially Über Jazz, on jazz is translated, has a different connotation, perhaps in the social science or philosophy, than the simple translation can get. The idiomatic, as I've been saying in several times in different places, is resistant to translation. When you translate, you don't get every nuance, right? So if you say Über jazz in social sciences, especially someone who's familiar with philosophy and German language, the Über there is also a connotation of the someone who writes on fascism, especially when they use it. And he's writing about jazz in 1936 in Europe. So the National Socialists, the fascists, have come to power. Their hero, the fascist hero, is the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And the ideal for, it might be unfair for them to have taken on Nietzsche. They didn't really understand Nietzsche. But he became the philosopher because of his concept of the Superman or the Übermensch, Superman, right? And so Überjazz has a little bit of that connotation of the Nietzschean Übermensch, the Superman. And you know, Nietzsche's critique in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of the people who are waiting and expecting this Übermensch is misread probably by the National Socialists as well. I mean, Nietzsche is very nuanced and difficult in translation as well, so is Adorno. But in that book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he is mocking of the people that are waiting for kind of cultural redemption, because they seem like dead inside. They are they have this ideal society. They think they've made the ideal society, and in that society they hop around the earth like little men, and they have this. He talks about how they're very proud of their culture, and they have they have a thing called education, which distinguishes them from goats. And so it's a bit mocking, but the idea of the Übermensch was taken by the Superman was taken by the German National Socialists and said, this is what the Germans are. The Germans can lead Europe. They are the supermen. And it's been shown that these soldiers in the Blitzkrieg, the German soldiers who rushed into France and Austria and France and Czechoslovakia and other countries, were fueled up on amphetamines and like able to fight for 3 days without sleep in this blitzkrieg. They were clearly, as we say, on drugs. But the drug was this dream of a greater Germany and Lebensraum, anyway, fascism. And Adorno, of course, was not the only intellectual to have been afraid of this, and in the 30s to have critiqued this. Georges Bataille is another, especially, and Walter Benjamin, that we started reading as well. And Walter Benjamin, of course, was trying to flee Germany like so many other Jewish intellectuals, and didn't make it, or suicided, it seems, on the border with Spain. Adorno himself left quite early, although he did keep coming back to Germany during the 30s. In 1933 is when the National Socialists, the Nazis, take power in 1933. But they were around before then. It's in 1933 is when they seize power. But Hitler had been building up the party, and the parties had become influential in social life all through the Weimar period. Weimar Germany was a kind of at that time, the Social Democrats were quite strong. The left wasn't strong enough to resist the rise of this populist right demagogue, Hitler, and his Nazi Hitler Youth and the party members who believed his vitriol. Right. Now, as I said, Adorno writes Überjazz in 1933, and it belongs to the critique of popular culture, but it's the one where more explicitly than others he has in mind the critique of fascism. And here it's interesting because in the little bit of video we just saw in Vietnam, he's critiquing the way in which popular culture is used to express ideological positions, right? That it's kind of obscene to make a commodity out of suffering or your political position on somebody suffering. And yet, you know, he's written this essay, Über Jazz, about popular culture for a political point. We'll see that as we unfold and unpack the essay. Now, the bigger context for this is his larger critique that comes out in the later book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, is about the industrialization of culture. How culture is, if industrialization is the right word, we've mentioned this several times in these lectures already, where Adorno thinks that Wagner is really the symbol of the first time that this happened, when parts of the orchestra are branded and compartmentalized, and as if then composition can be made into something like factory chain construction. And the assembly line of putting together an orchestra piece, or later a hit in the hit factories of America. Tin Pan Alley, they called it, the hit factories. And it doesn't mean that, maybe industry isn't the right word for the industrialization of culture. It's as if industry. What we really should focus on is how Adorno is concerned that the whole is being divided into parts so they can be manipulated for economic gain, right? And for manufacture, divided into parts so they can be commodified or assembled like commodities into a mass form, rather than the skill and creativity and the wholeness of works of art. And in a way, once we've started to do that with Wagner and so on, inexorably this process leads to the commodification of all culture, and we can't go back to a kind of bourgeois romantic ideal where there was a cultured individual who could enjoy, maybe enjoy is not even the right word, could participate in and appreciate orchestral music or any music. And jazz is kind of used in the essay as a symbol, right? So this is the big debate topic. Music and identity, it's mainstream and minority, questions of a diversity, you know, and it's often controversial. I would like to use the examples from the essay, but also bring in examples from, you know, entertainment magazines or music or any topics, right? So I asked you to read Über Jazz, but maybe some of the parts of the essay we really need to emphasize, right? He writes it in 1936, but he doesn't write it in his own name because he can't, because Adorno, Wiesengrund Adorno, Theodor, it's very obviously a Jewish name. And if you're Jewish in Germany, 1936 is when there was Kristallnacht, the night in which all the windows of the synagogues were smashed and all the windows of Jewish businesses were smashed. It's called Kristallnacht. You could hear the sound of breaking glass all over Germany because that was the day that the National Socialists decided to really target Jewish businesses. It's not possible for Adorno with an identifiably Jewish name to sign an article. It's even very difficult for him to get published at all in Germany. You know, he was used to being in the newspaper, you know, like every week in what was called the feuilleton. It's still the case that German newspapers like Die Zeit and so on carry academic essays. Adorno's teacher, Siegfried Kracke, And then I got a wonderful volume of Cracker here. This guy, him, Siegfried Cracker. This is the correspondence between young Adorno and Siegfried Cracker. He was his mentor, and some say he was in love. This is a beautiful volume of their essays. They were not sexually active, but Adorno was 14, and Siegfried was somewhat older. 15, Adorno was 15 or 16, and Cracker was 14 years older than him. But they became firm friends and discussed it. And Cracker went on to become the feuilleton editor of the Frankfurt Allgemeine, a daily paper in Frankfurt. You can get a volume of his essays for that feuilleton called The Mass Ornament, which is fantastic. And I think I put it on the course reading list. Tiller Girls and the Shop Girls Go to the Movies and the Salaried Masses is a great piece of sociological work, actually by Siegfried Cracker. He also writes, he goes to America. He's also a Jew who leaves Europe under the threat of the Nazis, escapes from Europe and goes to America and becomes writes fantastic essays on film under the Nazis and the theory of film. Probably his least interesting book, but still very important. I really love his book Orpheus in Paris, which is related, I think, in some way to Adorno's book on Wagner. But Orpheus in Paris, which Adorno didn't like, he said he didn't like anyway, is a study of the operettas, right, of the 1830s, 1840s. Operettas that were kind of popular versions of great opera tales, or kind of popularization. Operettas were it's not exactly vaudeville, but a more accessible version of high culture. So you had opera and ballet, right? And then you have a kind of more publicly accessible entertainment called the operetta, which would tell stories like Romeo and Juliet or Shakespearean tragedies or things like that with music, and Swan Lake and things like that. So it's kind of somewhere below Wagner, but on the path towards commercialization, the similar arguments. Anyway, Cracker was the editor of the Feuilleton, and so Adorno was used to getting published in these feuilletons during the late 20s, early 30s, but that stopped when the Nazis took power. It became more and more difficult to get published, so he uses a false name. Now, which false name? He uses the name Hector Rottweiler, which is a funny choice. Okay, what is a Rottweiler? Do you know what a Rottweiler is, anyone? A kind of dog that's big and aggressive, bigger than a German Shepherd or a Rhodesian Ridgeback, maybe about the same size, but has a very big head, wolf-like dog, a Rottweiler, and usually often used as guard dogs. Very aggressive, very aggressive. And Hector is Hector is a hero from the Iliad, Troy, Homer's epic about Troy, but Hector is on the wrong side. But it's also in English a word, hector. To hector someone is like Well, they say it's quite bad. This example, I don't know whether I should use it. They say hectoring would be, if a guy who's married who goes out for a drink after work comes home to his wife, to his hectoring wife, she'll give him a talking to when she comes, and she won't stop. Or to hector someone is to like heckle, right? To shout at them to the audience at them, to give them grief, to be annoyingly keep on at them for I don't know, say your tie's not straight, you're ugly, you're fat, or whatever. To shout out aggressively against someone. So that's a very interesting name to have chosen for your false name, for your pseudonym. Right? The hectoring, aggressively shouting, attack dog. The hectoring attack dog. Right? So it raises for me the question of what's this essay really about, Uber Jazz? Okay, and so he asks specific questions, not what jazz is, but what it's used for, and that's an interesting way of framing the question. And of course, it's a mass commodity, and it's ideal for fascism. The jazz, and that's interesting because, of course, the National Socialists banned some kinds of jazz because it was black music. But Adorno is concerned that the possibilities of interpreting jazz have disappeared because jazz is manufactured music, like in the same style in which Adorno critiqued Wagner. Jazz is parts put together into a whole. So you have the intro, 8 bars usually, 4/4 beat usually, or 3/4 swing, and then you have verse, chorus, a middle 8, and then a improvisation, and then a chorus and an end, right? There's a kind of formula for putting together a jazz track. He would have been shocked at now how the formula for putting together a hit record nowadays starts from, first of all, deciding what your music and your target audience will be, and then assembling the band, a boy or a girl band. You've got to have that character, the different characters, different personality types, the different hairstyle, everything is calculated to a kind of formula. But he was already saying that about jazz. But actually, he was concerned about the way in which jazz, with its beat, and he was very concerned about what the beat did to people who listened to jazz, right? Because it was fast and repetitive. It was very similar to marching music. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the beat, syncopated, to get you into a rhythm that was kind of bred a bodily conformity. I mean, his most vivid critique in this level is how things like the jitterbug, right, the kind of dancing, which was a phenomenon in the 30s, turned you into not a dancer so much as an insect. Right? But in this Uber Jazz essay, he talks about how this compartmentalization of the music made it somewhat like military music to a beat, marching music, and that would be really ideal for fascism. So, in a sense, the rhythm insistence on rhythm and knowing in advance what is going to happen is very similar to marching music, which is designed to get a body of people and form them into a undifferentiated group and move them forward like an army. Yeah, and within this you'll have improvisation. Sure, there's the improv, the solo, but it's within the section of the track which is for the solo. So it's an improvisation contained within a section. So it never escapes that section as well. The improvisation which revolts against collective power by being individual can't revolt because it's contained within the middle section. So its revolt seems ridiculous and beaten down by the drum. And he keeps on using the metaphors of the language of music to say, look, this is language of music as commodity, to show that this is like as if a military operation. So that jazz gets you stuck, takes the dancers, turns them into bugs and keeps them in the grooves of order in the record. The record is made with grooves, and the needle runs in its track and goes nowhere, just goes round and round, according to the beat. Very interesting that he says all these things that seem to go so far beyond actually talking about the music. And you've got to be a little bit suspicious of that, in the sense that, okay, all right, let's step back a little bit. Adorno is, why is that in my thing not changed? He's closely allied to philosophers. Benjamin, thinking about history and his fascination with frozen moments and the snow globe, the Schneedom, right? I think I've talked about these. Here we go. We've got a classic one from Vietnam, tourism shop. All right, let me show you that one. I've shown it before probably. All right, this is the tank from the gate, the 390 tank, the one that went through the gates of the Independence Palace. But somebody's put, one of the souvenir stores has put a snow dome on the top of it with the Vietnam flag in it, like as a trinket for tourists to buy in a souvenir shop, because in souvenir shops, tourists buy snow domes. It's famous from the film of Citizen Kane, where Kane is holding a snow dome, and that's like the symbol throughout the film. Benjamin talked about Schneegloben, snow domes as being these frozen moments of metaphor culture and so on. And I guess the incongruity of this one, right? So Vietnam souvenir. I mean, it's funny because like it doesn't snow, right, in Ho Chi Minh City, and yet you have a snow dome. It's the tank that destroyed the gates, and so it's then that tank is still there in the grounds of the Independence Palace. There's two there, but the 391 is the famous one. Well, actually, there's a bit of debate about who was the commander of the tank and so on. I mean, it really is bizarre that there's snow in a snow dome on top of it, but you know, they've made the object in order to sell 120,000 dong. It's not that expensive. It's okay. And I would have paid more for that because it's just so bad. It's so bad it's good. But Benjamin will say that these are frozen moments of significance, these snow domes. They what people want to put on show. Like a souvenir is something that you want to have as a memento, as a little monument to memory. And this certainly is a memento of memory of, like, it's now the tank itself in the grounds of the Independence Palace stands as like a statue, like as a monument to that great moment of the tanks riding through the gates. But it's a frozen moment. It's frozen out of context in a way. And that's why it becomes a souvenir that you can take home and you can put on your shelf next to your books, which is bizarre because, yeah, it forgets the context, and takes that moment and forgets all of the history and everything that went up to it. It condenses all that history into this one image. It was the flag that's inside the dome there that was going to be put on top of the roof. And that will symbolize so much. Of course it does. But that these things can be sold as commodities, 120,000 dong to buy the revolution, right? And to remember the revolution, to commemorate it in a kind of kitschy way. It's kitsch. You know what kitsch means? I mean, the tanks didn't have hammer and sickle on the side of them, did they? I mean, maybe some people painted hammer and sickle, but there we go. Anyway, so Benjamin's theory of history is that these metaphors, these like a snow dome, or other things in history, other metaphors like storytelling by Scheherazade from the 1001 Nights, or unpacking your books in the library. These things can be allegories or metaphors or allegories that tell us more about politics than maybe explicit political analysis might, because they're more memorable. They're more like, they congeal so many different meanings that they're almost overdetermined in terms of what they signify. Right? So that, and Benjamin, when he was writing this essay on history, and Adorno, they were in conversation together, and Benjamin was critiqued by Adorno very strongly. Adorno was trying to keep Benjamin on a kind of Marxist track, remembering about commodification and so on, whereas Benjamin was flirting with more experimental concepts and the mystical and the esoteric, but they fundamentally agreed on this path of talking about literary sensibility, a kind of metaphoric or allegorical style in texts. In fact, it's Adorno's greatest book, Minima Moralia, that is a great tribute to Benjamin's style, and in fact, the essays in here, they're really awesome. Each chapter is about a page and a half, right? Some even a page. There are like about 150 short chapters. It's in English as well. I don't know whether it's not translated yet into Tingviet that I know of. Minima Moralia, but it's quite fantastic. Where he talks at one point about the snow dome, he talks about militarism, he talks about style, talks about things like gaps. I mean, almost every page is of significance. He talks about dialectics, Karl Kraus, the idea of the inside and the outside, ego, dancing, the invitation to dance. All right, so here just randomly about dance. The admonition to be happy, voiced in concert by the scientifically Epicurean sanatorium director. So you should be happy, says the doctor of the insane asylum. Or the highly strung propaganda chiefs of the entertainment industry. So the highly strung propaganda chiefs of the entertainment industry, the Uber assistant West Coast promo men. Did you get those albums? You know, Kiss Jakey on the head. You got to move some of those albums, man. You got to that high-pitched salesperson and the scientist saying, "Be happy, don't worry." You know, they're not the scientists, the psychologists saying, have about them the same attitude as a father who criticizes his children for not joyously rushing downstairs when he comes home irritable from his office. So he's basically saying that the self-help mentality of psychology and the consumption impresarios of the culture industry, the salespeople of new culture products, are a bit like egocentric, like a grumpy dad coming home telling his children off. Right? So customers are like children, and salespeople is like grumpy dad telling his children off for not being excited that he's come home. It's part of the mechanism of domination to forbid recognition of the suffering it produces. You're not allowed to recognize that actually being left alone is right. And there's a straight line of development between the gospel of happiness, you shall be happy, and the construction of the camps of extermination so far off in Poland that each of our countrymen can convince themselves that he cannot hear the screams of pain. Wow. So the admonition to be happy. You know what was written? Does anyone know what was written on the gates of the concentration camp Auschwitz, the gas chamber, where the gas chambers were? What did they have on the gates? Anyone know? Not familiar with the history of fascism? So the gas chamber was inside a concentration camp called Auschwitz, and trains jammed full, cattle trucks basically jammed full of people, Jewish people were transported all over Germany and France and Austria and so many other countries, and brought to Auschwitz, marched off the train, marched into barracks, and marched into the gas chambers, told they were going to be washed, but they were gassed through shower heads that poured out noxious gas and things. As they went through the gates into the camp, they went underneath a sign carved into the metalwork of the gates over the top that said, "Arbeit macht frei." Work will make you free. It's similar to the self-help stuff about be happy, or you know, work will make you free. Concentrate on your work and you will be happy. Right? On the gates of a gas chamber. So that's really the ideology of fascism. They're actually exterminating people, but at the same time telling them to be happy, because we cannot possibly recognize or admit that pointless work really is pointless. Anyway, this book is amazingly full of things like that. And what it says about metaphor and allegory, how important metaphor and allegory are for ideology, is also important. Is incredibly important, incredibly potent and powerful. How arguments proceed by means of making allegories. So when we think about this essay, Uber Jazz, right? It's within the context of this philosophy. Now, he has stuff to say about philosophy as well. The task of philosophical education today, he says, it seems to me, is to serve those who seriously desire such an education, specifically by immunizing them against the countless philosophical slogans and ready-made concepts that swirl around us everywhere, right? Like be happy, or work hard and you'll succeed. An education must see through those slogans, right? They swirl around us everywhere, and some people imagine they provide a kind of guide, a norm, and an orientation for living. They're refusing the trouble of actually thinking about them critically. Right? An amazingly great point. So many things in this is how fascism works. So many things in and how there's a continuity between fascism and the culture industry. So many things that we consume, we do so unthinkingly, right? Without subjecting them to serious critique of how they're manufactured for us, how we're prepared to go along with them. Right now, instead, Adorno wants to say the educated sociological mind must be one where all people are taught a kind of dialectical thinking, which we could define as not content with only understanding the order of concepts, but takes time to think about the conceptual order of being of objects that we are consuming, right? And this is the vital nerve of dialectical thinking. It's the reverse of what's generally taken to be thought, right? You think a concept and you apply it. No, it's overcomes that simple manipulation, but recognizes there's a method in thinking which is not merely a method, but an attempt to overcome the arbitrary nature of applying whatever concept to whatever object, right? It's very difficult stuff. Dialectical thinking is not just a kind of thinking that you can apply. It must be a thinking that examines thinking, as well as in the process of application. So it's always reflecting on its concepts. So when it's thinking, when it's not like you can say, okay, let's apply Adorno to Vietnam. You can't simply do that. In order to apply Adorno, to think what would Adorno have said about Vietnam, you have to, first of all, ask the question of whether you can even do that. What does it mean to try and take Adorno's style of thinking, critique of allegory, of metaphor, and so on, and try and think about any part of contemporary culture, whether it be the souvenir or V-pop or what have you. Now, in Minimum Moralia, in this book, Adorno has these great passages. Right, here's another one. In his childhood, some elderly English ladies with whom his parents had kept up relations, they often gave him books as presents. And these were richly illustrated works for the young, and a small green Bible bound in Morocco leather. They were all in the language of the donors, which is then English, right? Which I could read it. Whether I could read it, none of them paused to reflect. They just gave the books. The inaccessibility of the books, with their glaring pictures, their titles and vignettes and indecipherable text, filled me with the belief that in general objects of this kind were not books at all, but advertisements, perhaps for machines like those my uncle produced in his London factory. So here's a great moment of Adorno reflecting on his own introduction to the culture industry. The books are offered to him, they come in a different language, so they're not books at all. They're advertisements for English, as not just as a language, but as a kind of propaganda for the whole of English empire. Right? And that's what these grannies, that are elderly English ladies who his parents knew, were circulating a copy of the Bible. They're not giving him a Bible to read. They didn't even think, does he read English? I mean, you can get Bibles in German, right? If they were Christian. But they are distributing books as if they're souvenirs of English. So he keeps on in this style in Minima Moralia, right? Since I came to live in Anglo-Saxon countries, he came to live in 1935 or something, he came to understand English. His awareness of that process of books being advertisements has not been dispelled but strengthened. There's a song by Brahms, a poem by Hesse with the lines, "O Herzleid, du Eigenwerk, Selbanda nur ist Seligkeit." In the most widely used American edition, this is rendered, "O misery, eternity, but two in one were ecstasy." The archaic, passionate nouns of the original, right? The "O Herzfield, du Ewigkeit," have been turned into catchwords and turned into a hit song designed to boost the song, right? Illuminated in the neon light, switched on by these words, culture displays its character as advertising. Think of how a slogan has a certain meaning, but once you put it up on a poster, it also becomes a sign. Like, you know, whether it's in neon lights or not, it's advertising. It's false. It's a trick to attract your attention. Arbeit macht frei. Arbeit macht frei. Works will set you free. Arbeit macht frei. So, you know, this is Adorno's style of critique, to recognize that it's not the content of something that needs to be understood. It's what the thing does, right? And this is why I think this is really important for understanding what he's saying in Über Jazz, right? So when he's critiqued, he got his critique of the music of the future from Marx, and actually is a critique of Wagner, because Wagner talked about Zukunftsmusik, the music of the future. He sees this as a confirmation of the logic of capitalism as he diagnosed it. This is Isabel Stengers, the great theorist of capitalist society, contemporary theorist. It doesn't make it doesn't make the case that you have to pay attention to what the thing is really saying, but what it does. Okay, so I put here the slogan, "The War of the Worlds." Now, there's a good example. A War of the Worlds in Orson Welles' radio play was, using H.G. Wells' story, was a radio play that was used to sell soap. And pretty much it hardly ever mattered what they put in the radio play as long as the ads eventually played. Where this one broke down, Orson Welles' story, is that it became more than an ad. People acted on it. It did something. Now, what Adorno's dialectical thought does is recognize what things do. So if you applied it to Western films, here's an example of the Western film, The Magnificent Seven, right? It's set in the old Wild West of the early days of America, The Magnificent Seven. But really, what is this film, the Western, doing, if not saying America will triumph over all in the now, right? This is, I mean, they're on horses and with rifles, but it's really set up like they're on aeroplanes flying into the battle. I look at the way in which the 7 people fought like 700, and this is a ripoff of Seven Samurai from Kurosawa. Kurosawa's great, the Japanese director Kurosawa's great film, Seven Samurai. right? About the Ronin samurai who saved a village. But now it's presented into something like ideology of the American armed forces coming up through Europe and so on. Not unidentical to this explicit wartime propaganda of getting women to come into the factories as part of the war effort, right? So this is when we go back to think about Hector Rottweiler and Uber jazz, right? And Adorno is writing about jazz, but it's not jazz that he hates. He's not writing about jazz because it's regimented. He's writing about German military music, but he can't explicitly give you a story, say German military music is bad, the Germans are turning into an army, they're thinking in this regimented terms and destroying any possibility of, and it's a disaster ready to happen, and he's right about that. But if he wrote that, it would not be published in Germany. If he wrote about jazz and critiqued jazz, but left enough clues in there for people who could read to recognize that what he really means is military organization of the National Socialists is the danger. His critique of jazz is an allegory. The name Hector Rottweiler, a dog that hectors, that tries to push forward a position, pushing hard to say, you know, jazz is bad, it's the culture industry, is really an anti-fascist text. It's saying that actually it's the marching music that is the danger. Jazz is not what it is, but what it's used for. Marching music is not music, it's marching. It's a mechanical military organization, military band, right, is adapted to fascism, to mobilize collective power in a forced regimented machine-like human phylum, the block of soldiers who will march in unison and run over Europe, right? So ever since, people have said, oh no, jazz, Adorno attacked jazz. How could he do that? Jazz is black music and it's for progressives and so on. I mean, jazz in the 1930s anyway was, sure, there were black jazz musicians, but jazz in Europe was pretty much swing, big band jazz, white musicians. There's big band ensembles playing this kind of easy listening music, right? So it's not like our assessment of jazz 50 years later, which would say, well, that's jazz is definitely the music of Thelonious, of Coltrane, of Black America, and we're all in favor of it because we're not racist. That's a misplaced critique. And Adorno ever since has suffered from this critique, that his allegory has been misunderstood. Now, what would be the allegory you told about Vietnam? About the war, about, I don't know, elements of the war, about the whole story of what happened to American soldiers in this place where they were far from home, being killed and listening to rock and roll, and it was the apocalypse in the jungle. They were afraid of what would happen outside the wire, and you know, even Spike Lee comes back just 2 years ago to make another film where the soldiers come back and they go through again that kind of fear of the jungle, and hopefully this time though it will resolve itself differently. I don't know if you've seen the film with Spike Lee 2 years ago, but they'll come back and they get, you know, they win the gold. They get paid eventually. I mean, reparations, they see it, and they give the gold to the Black Lives Matter movement. No one from Vietnam gets any gold. Only the black soldiers this time get gold that they didn't get when they were soldiers. Another allegory. what Adorno gives us is the possibility of recognizing allegorical, dialectical thinking is a mode of powerful philosophical critique that will penetrate the way in which history is presented, right? Those posters of the war and of the after the war, right, when Americans were surging through Europe to sell American culture, Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell in the same color palette as that poster, is something else. So when we see propaganda films about the war, right, and I've used this image quite often, Rambo fighting in Vietnam, right, winning the war. America did not win the war, we all remember, sure, but Americans forget that. They forget what the war was really like, what they had seen on their TVs back in 1972, 73, 68, 69. Right? They had seen the image of war was not a romantic Rambo, crazy muscle bound, or the fantastic World War II heroes of those days, but the defeated American soldier, tired and disarmed. And that would be the dialectic right there between these three images. Fantasy rewriting, original heroic war soldier, actual soldier in exhaustion but covered in, like, made of weapons, not just wearing the weapons, wearing the bullets as a kind of decoration, but actually this one completely consumed by bullets but exhausted under the weight of the horror of the war. This helicopter in the jungle on these, look at the landing mat that he's on. Do you see this, the metal landing mats that they use? You know, you find them still all over Vietnam. I was in Dalat last Christmas, I think it was. And there's a cafe that uses those landing mats that the Americans made in Nevada, but they brought to Vietnam to use them so that the helicopters could land in the jungle, right? They had to put down these metal mats. Then they used them as torture implements in the prison in Con Dao and in Phu Quoc. But now they're used as the walls of a cafe in Dalat. But anyway, the dialectic, sorry, we're talking about that. The dialectic is between not the good war of World War II, where the heroes were us and the enemy were the Nazis, then the exhausted and defeated American soldier who couldn't fight anymore, rewritten now by Hollywood as Rambo coming to one man, like more than the Magnificent Seven. He's as good as seven all at once. He saves all the prisoners of war and then in the next film defeats Afghanistan and then Iraq, and I think it's in the last one, which just came out like 2 years ago, he takes on Mexico. It sort of doesn't matter whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or Mexico. This kind of critique, this allegory is still complete fantasy, spat from the barrel of a gun. So, last bit. When Adorno writes in the concept of history, the people that have emerged victorious, they participate. Whoever has emerged victorious in the war participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those that are lying prostrate. Right? So the present rulers still are America, but not for long. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in the procession. They are called cultural treasures, and historical materialists use them with caution. Right? This is Adorno's influence on Benjamin there. Historical materialist, meaning Marxist. Without exception, cultural treasures that he surveys have an origin which you cannot contemplate without horror. This is the symbol of 40 years of brutal war. right? Now sold to souvenirs as a cute trinket. Someone said it's cute. I mean, yeah, sure it is. And yet, we also have to think this is from the war, all the suffering that, right? They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great minds and talents who have created them, but also the anonymous toil of their contemporary, the Marxist critique. Right? There's no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. So not just, this is what Benjamin says about documents, that, you know, I don't know, what's a document of civilization that he might have had in mind? He might have had in mind the treaty to end the war, right? The Paris Accords, or the Versailles Agreement, or whatever. Any treaty to rid the war is also a document that indicates that there was a war, that there was 40 years of killing. This little souvenir is dripping with blood, the martyrs of the dead. Martyrdom of hundreds of thousands. And it's now a trinket, a snow dome, right? A historical materialist then dissociates himself from this souvenir insofar as it's possible, and tries to sees their task as brushing against the grain of history, not to accept this process of a souvenir shop in every museum. Right? Sometimes the museum should leave you upset. I took the class actually once to the Women's Museum, and there was a few people who had never been and had not really recognized that in the history of, there was a display of Al Yai, right? And in one of the displays, where you're kind of going along this lovely, elegant history of Al Yai over the years, how it changes and so on. And then in one corner, there was someone dressed in a kind of version of Al Yai that was suited for fighting, and they had strung over them a weapon. And these two students in particular kind of bumped into this and were completely thrown out of their expectation and their comfort zone at all, to suddenly be confronted with this thing that was quite an emotional experience for them. There is the moment of Adorno in Vietnam, because there was the reflexive, frozen moment, if you like. And it can be anything. It can be a souvenir like this, or it can be a model of someone wearing Al Yai with a gun strapped over their shoulder, or it could be a document. That is a document of barbarism, even though it's also a sign that at least that war is over. And it can be memorialized, made into a little trinket and sold in a museum that remembers that stuff, but thank God it's over. Although Adorno's critique would also say, but is it really over? Has that thinking that allowed the war to happen not just moved somewhere else? It's a lot of burden for a little object to carry, right? To take a trinket like this, a commodity, but it means so much more. And for this now to signify for me critique of kitsch, critique of trinkets, critique of commodities, Adorno, his history, Benjamin, his history, Siegfried Krake, so many things that are carried on the tracks of this now obsolete tank, let alone the names of tanks and something like Panzer and yeah, let's not get into that. It's I should mention, we also should recognize all the aspects to it. I read out the price underneath, but I didn't read out there's also this carved into it is I don't know whether you can see this in the picture. Underneath, it's designed by Chamstone. But actually, designed is spelt wrong. D-E-S-I-G-N-D-E. So that sounds a bit French, but it's not. It's a typo, spelling error. So another dimension of curio of this. It's carved by someone who didn't check the. I think even those words are probably stamped into it, not one by one, but the stamp was made. Anyway, ideally we would have gone to visit the Independence Palace and seen the tanks in person as a class trip, but I'm afraid pandemic, that's not going to happen. But we'll stop there. Thank you very much.